this panel, which is Future Society, but in fact it's connecting the past, present, and future. This panel is sort of looking more broadly, and so I want to make sure that we kind of touch on the big theoretical questions, but I also would like to involve the audience, so we're going to follow a slightly different format. Also because one of our speakers has to leave, so it's this experience. So we're going to go one after the other, and I'll be very time efficient, and then we will open up the forum to questions from the audience, if that's okay. So I will be strict on time, if that's okay. Okay. Benefit. So the first speaker is Nick Spencer from Theos, who edited a volume on the future of welfare. And you're welcome to describe, for those of you who don't know anything about the think tank.
I will, but very, very briefly, seeing as I don't intrude into my 5 minutes. Good afternoon, it's a real pleasure to be here. I'm Nick Spencer, I'm Research Director of Theos. Theos is a Christian think tank based in Westminster dealing with religion and public life. And I'm the panel member who's going to be sneaking out early, so I apologise for that in advance. Three massive questions. What kind of society do we want in the future? How important is trust for a sense of collectivity? And to what extent should the demonstration of faith or secular values contribute to notions of society? Each of which is a huge question. Put together, there are three huge questions, which I'm now going to answer in 5 minutes. Apologies
you have seven,
for...
You're seven.
I've got seven? Well, I can tell you more about Theos then, if you like. Oliver Letwin, the Conservative politician, gave a speech a number of years ago remarking on the curious fact and the telling fact that the English language had no equivalent for the word shalom. No equivalent for a word meaning holistic peace, if you like. In recent years, it's been interesting to see how the phrase the common good, most popularly associated with Catholic social teaching, has been come to used possibly in a synonymous way. However, the phrase the common good has a certain elasticity to it, which I think perhaps explains why it's so popular, but it also sometimes means that different people talk about the common good without necessarily meaning exactly the same thing. Whether you want to talk about a society marked by shalom or a society marked out by the common good, I would argue that the society we would like, or let's be specific, I would like in the future, is one that's marked by high relational values. A society in which people know, trust, and seek the best for one another. That society in which people live within their material and environmental means, in which marriages are strong and lasting, in which children are brought up in secure homes, in which relatives remain connected and mutually supportive, in which neighbourhoods are welcoming and also supportive, in which employees feel a sense of appreciation and value in their work, in which employers understand employees as having worth in themselves and of having greater significance than capital, and so on and so forth. I don't want to get too misty-eyed or utopian about that, but I would argue that a good society is a fundamentally relational society. That is a very obvious lead into the second question, whether trust or how much trust is important to a good society and a sense of collectivity. In a sense, I can answer that question in one word: very. Trust is very important. We may be realistic enough to know that we will never generate a total trust society, but I think it's probably fair to argue that societies marked by high levels of trust are better in many different dimensions than non-trusting societies. And that particular issue provides a challenge for us, because the UK is a more diverse society today than for many, many years. Moreover, when we talk about diversity, I think it's fair to say we're talking about substantive diversity and not superficial, or what you might call restaurant diversity. The growing diversity of not simply of what people choose to eat and wear, but why they choose to eat and wear it. Underlying these social and cultural phenomena are different conceptions of the good, of the value of choice, of the meaning and value of human life, indeed the meaning and value of animal life, of the propriety of sexual conduct, of the nature of the family, of the importance of national identity, of the meaning of equality. These are substantive differences of the good. Now, I think it's important to recognise that there is very considerable geographic variety hidden beneath that statement. Levels of diversity vary hugely across the UK. Not everywhere is super diverse, to use that term that's gained credence recently. Not every society is diverse. Nonetheless, the indication of travel has been towards greater, if uneven, levels of diversity. And if trust is important to you, that does present a challenge. This year, the Migration Observatory at the University of Oxford asked the question, does increased diversity undermine social cohesion? And they reported that most of the empirical literature on this subject finds the relationship between diversity and trust is negative. The more diverse a community is, the less likely individuals in it are to be trusting. And that crystallises the challenge that perhaps leads on to the third question. To what extent should the demonstration of faith or of secular values, particularly in the context of local initiatives, contribute to notions of society? On the one hand, we recognise the reality of diversity today and the significance of respecting it. People genuinely are different and sometimes have quite deep differences, and to pretend otherwise is in some small measure to dehumanise them. This does not, of course, preclude the desire to change and modify other people. After all, that's what all human interaction is about. But it does mean recognising that what you are changing is important rather than superficial to other people, and that therefore coercion should really be used as a last resort. On the other hand, we recognise, to coin a phrase that was mentioned earlier on this morning, that there is such a thing as society, and that we would like to live in a nation that, to use Jonathan Sachs's well-worn analogy, is closer to being a home than merely a hotel. So you have a tension there between, if you like, diversity, or deep diversity on the one hand, and trust on the other. This is not a soluble problem. It is not a problem to which there is a solution, let alone an easy one. It's a problem which we negotiate and deal with. And I want to offer you two ideas with which to negotiate it from reports that Theos have published over recent years. One of them is from a report entitled, it's full title, I've got it here, Making Multiculturalism Work, Enabling Practical Action Across Deep Difference. It was by David Barclay, who actually works for Angus, who'll be speaking later. This was the result of an empirical study of local initiatives in East London, operated by groups that were very different and often contentiously different in their ideological or religious commitments. David wrote that ordinary relationships across religious and cultural difference are the key to addressing the malaise of the public square and pursuing a meaningful multicultural settlement. These are forged not by a widespread adherence to the abstract national values or an idea of what multiculturalism should look like, but rather by common action. The argument he was making, drawing on the research he was conducting, that insisting that people leave their particular ideological or religious baggage at the door before they cooperate with one another in endeavours of mutual interest is counterproductive in many different ways. And in actual fact, groups that are marked by deep difference can work together, and do work together, on projects of mutual, immediate, local concern. And it's through that common practice that they begin to build the bridges across the wider chasms of their ideological difference. That begs a question, which is, would you work with anybody effectively? And the second provocation, or second kind of response I wanted to leave you with, was from Jonathan Chaplin's essay for us, Multiculturalism, A Christian Retrieval. This was a theoretical piece on multiculturalism, but towards the end, Jonathan drew the distinction between what he called mere citizenship and virtuous citizenship. Broadly speaking, mere citizenship comprises those things that a government may legitimately demand and compel, such as abiding by law, paying taxes, respecting fundamental constitutional rights and freedoms of all citizens, including those with whom you disagree vigorously, accepting the outcomes of constitutional democratic government, agreeing to work within structures to change legislation, so on and so forth. These are the sine qua non for operating in public life, if you like, the qualities of mere citizenship. Virtuous citizenship, by contrast, is more demanding. The virtuous citizen will vote, volunteer, campaign, donate. He or she will, in short, contribute to society. Now, a society of mere citizens will be a secure society, but not, I would suggest, a particularly happy or high-trust one. And if we're being honest, most of us, and I certainly include myself in this, would like to live in a society of virtuous citizens rather than mere citizens. However, there is a question, and I'll draw my remarks to a conclusion now, there is a question of how we move from one to the other. The argument in Jonathan's essay, which I think has a lot going for it, is that the state may seek to nurture public virtue, but it oversteps its grounds if it compels it, even if it makes it a criterion for receipt of public money. The state must, for its own security, for the security of all of us, insist on mere citizenship, but it should seek to facilitate virtuous citizenship rather than compel it, because ultimately the job of making virtuous citizens, virtuous trusting citizens, lies with other virtuous trusting citizens, and it's a job of persuasion rather than coercion. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. I think you've raised a question that was raised in the first two panels, which is about the tension between the government and what its expectations are, and of what citizens or people who are active on the ground expect and want the government to do. Following our format, I will go straight to John Lawrence, who's a reader in modern British history here, and he's interested in politics and class identity. Or am I getting
Yeah. And he's speaking for history, as it were.
Yes,
So
exactly, which is very
history
important.
does have implications for the present and the future.
Yes.
That's my plan anyway. Let's see if I'm right. Okay, so yeah, Shana asked me to talk from an historical basis, really of my current research, which is on the shifting balance between individualism and community-centeredness in Britain since the 1930s, coming down to the late 2000s, because I'm an historian, right? So the headline I would stress is that we need to stop seeing individualism and communalism as opposites, and that ordinary people are not social theorists, and they can happily and do happily live with the contradiction of being a bit of both. That's really something that runs through all the surveys I look at from the 1930s onwards. So we're currently surrounded by talk of the collapse of community and the broken society. From both left and right, people argue that to halt this inexorable slide towards social disintegration, we need to breathe new life into collective identities, such as community and class, which supposedly once acted as a bulwark against the tide of selfish individualism. Philip Vaughan's Red Toryism, Maurice Glassman's Blue Labour, and the wave of recent books proclaiming the importance of reviving class politics all demonstrate facets of this phenomenon. But we should be wary. The individualist revolution of the past half-century has brought enormous gains in terms of personal freedom. It is also very far from a local story. The social pressure to conform to external norms of behaviour, the pressure to be normal rather than happy, as Jeanette Winterson puts it, has weakened across the Western world and beyond in the past half-century, eroded from both within and without. From without by increased mobility and new mass media, and from within by rising expectations of life driven by direct personal experience, by seeing people in the same situation forging lives that are not just different from, but palpably better than, the life prescribed by custom and habit. These are changes that should not, and probably cannot, be reversed. The political implications of this are profound, but they are, I think, too often ignored. We have to start from where people are, not where we would like them to be. Most people are radically disengaged from the idea of class politics, for instance. Most are also, I would argue, feeling disengaged from community. But here, disengagement is tinged with regret. Crucially, in many cases, it is also exaggerated. People's ideal of community is so exacting that the mundane social interactions of their everyday lives are largely discounted. but they are by no means insignificant. We need to puncture the myths of community, which actually, to be honest, we were perpetuating a bit this morning at times. But we need to puncture those myths to help people to see the communal aspects of the lives they are now living and how they could be strengthened. So Robert Putnam's bleak assessment of social fragmentation in the famous book Bowling Alone, The Collapse and Revival of American Community, has often been taken as an accurate account of modern Britain, despite considerable academic reservations, which I'm sure Gabriella could tell us more about. So many people have pointed out academically that it doesn't work, but the media largely think it does. One reason may be that we pay too much attention to the elite cultural narratives of decline, and too little to what ordinary people say and feel about the changes in their own lives. My current research project seeks to redress that balance by telling the story of social change over the last 70 plus years exclusively through people's own words as they were recorded at the time, i.e. I don't actually use retrospective accounts at all. The project is based on interrogating the surviving speech of ordinary people as it was recorded by social scientists conducting community studies across England from the 1930s to the late 2000s. Now, I can only give you a few headlines here. I could obviously talk for hours, any academic could, but the key points that seem to me to be relevant for our discussions today are the following. I'm not going to number them because I always forget the numbers. But firstly, and I think probably most importantly, there is nothing new about individualism in English culture. Its roots lie deep in the Reformation, or at least they do for those of indigenous Protestant descent. Even in the 1940s and the 1950s, people were wary of close relations with neighbours, and most lived by the code that they, quote, kept themselves to themselves. This is what you hear ad nauseum from classic, traditional working class communities. So we have not become individualist. Rather, the more communal facets of our society and polity have been hollowed out, leaving our individualism to appear dominant. This is partly a story of social change. These are the bits probably we're not reversing. Mass media, I'm sorry to say this to you, secularization, greater geographic and social mobility, more two-earner households, you could go on and on. But it's also about government policies which have deliberately accentuated potential fault lines, particularly those between the working and non-working poor, whilst also overseeing the erosion of public spaces within which cooperation and social solidarity might flourish. But it's important that we don't simply theorise from our own lives, which typically involve much greater levels of social and geographic mobility than is normal. And again, I think there was some of that this morning. Nearly half of all school-aged children in Britain are still cared for by an extended family member on a weekly basis. Family is not as dispersed or as dead as many of us assume from our own lives. There are many ways in which socialising has in fact increased rather than decreased since the imagined golden age of community. In particular, taboos around having strangers in the house have given way to a culture of home entertaining. Here, actually, the turning point was a craze in Britain in the 1970s for installing domestic bars, sound systems, and knocking through your house so that you could actually entertain, because traditionally you didn't let anyone into your house who wasn't a member of the family. Many are still wary of being too close to immediate neighbours for fear of falling out, but mixed sex socialising with friends at home and out has increased sharply since the 1960s, alongside the triumph of so-called individualism. You also have to accept, I'm afraid, that welfare is understood through a language of contract in popular culture, and always has been. We've paid in, we deserve to be looked after in sickness, in old age, etc. This is not necessarily individualistic in that people believe that people like them also deserve a fair deal, but it does cut across more universalist conceptions of welfare which have very little purchase in English popular culture. Again, probably secular Protestantism is playing its part here. So you need to think about ways to extend contractualism, not to pretend that you're going to win that intellectual battle. You won't. But probably the change which speaks most directly to the issues that concern us here today, and my final point, is the collapse of a popular sense of historical progress that is shared by all. This was enormously strong between 1945 and 1970, roughly. It was how people made sense of their own and their wider families' experience of the post-war boom. The notion of a shared journey survives. It runs through most of the heritage industry, for instance, and it's there in popular genealogy as well. but it has become purely historicised. The shared journey is over. Now we're on our own, is the message. In the 1980s, that's when it happened, in the 1980s, polarised political arguments closed off the space in which aspirations for self and family might find expression in ways compatible with broader society-wide progress. But this was not inevitable. I could go on about, actually it was the left as much as the right that made this happen, but anyway. But this was not inevitable, and though it will be very hard to reverse, doing so provides the key to shifting popular culture back to a more altruistic, solidaristic plane. My thoughts from history.
Thank you. I think I would imagine people from the first two panels would want to talk to you
Yeah, I
about
think it's
your conclusions. The next speaker is somebody I actually have to thank profusely. I have to thank the next two speakers profusely because the Institute has called upon them several times in the past couple days to do things for us, as well as Chris Baker, who's also been, and Angus, you belong to the Christian Psyche. So anyway, I will thank you for showing up for us. The Institute appreciates it. Kai is a director of Interlink, which is an umbrella body for local projects for the Orthodox community in North London. They also have offices in Newcastle and in Manchester. And she's going to speak, as is due to, I would imagine, Abdurrahman, to their about the experience with in their own communities, which I think will be a nice difference in perspective from John and from Nick. Yeah, thank you, Kai.
Okay, I'm trying to be well behaved, and you gave me questions, so I sort of focused on those questions, which is sort of bigger than. But there you go. Let's go. But I think there are. Thank you for having me, and I think that absolutely, we come from a very different perspective. I'm a practitioner. I run the network of Orthodox Jewish community organisations, but the themes that were raised, I think it's really interesting how there's how they resonate. And I think some of the examples that I'm going to mention, you can actually see some of those concepts played out. So, so there you go. The big, massive questions, and the big one is, what kind of society do we want? And Nick spoke about a relational society, and relationships being important, and I think that is very much what we feel, and in our network is the big drive. We want a society in which people take responsibility for each other, and a society that particularly takes responsibility for the destitute and the vulnerable. We don't want a society, I wasn't here this morning, but I'm sure this is what was covered. We don't want a society in which the poor are hungry, in which disabled people are uncared for. Particularly relevant today is, we don't want a society in which people grow old and then become isolated and alone. And I think that many of us will probably agree that it's a mark of shame on our society what happens to many people when they become old and infirm. I come from a faith-based perspective. We're not engaged in faith activities, but it's in the case of myself and my network, faith is a major propellant of what we do. Clearly, people have similar aspirations and motivations without faith. People who are secular people and humanists are also driven, also have an equal sense of solidarity and a compulsion to be responsible for each other. But it does seem that where there is faith, there are particularly high responses and high levels of social responsibility and social action. The question we have is, if we accept that social responsibility and responding to need is important, the question is then how? This was also touched upon, is it through the state that we want to do this, or is it through civic action, non-state action, but through civil society? And the practical reality is that either way has got its advantages and disadvantages, and that there is a balance to be struck here. And I think that the wider subject outside of this particular session, the subject of austerity and what that has done to, what that has instigated and generated in civil society is looking at exactly that question, that balance between state action and civil society action. What the advantages of the state are is that it provides rights and entitlements to people, while civil society is by its nature, it's voluntary, and it offers voluntary action. So the advantage of when the state acts is that there's universal coverage and there are sort of minimum guarantees, there's entitlement here, whereas voluntary action doesn't offer that, but it brings a very different set of advantages. It brings warmth, it brings humanity, it brings solidarity. The state also suffers from bureaucracy, from administrative overkill, from inefficiencies, whereas civil society and social action can engage and bring out the very best of human beings. It brings out flexibility, responsiveness, imagination, creativity. I'll just demonstrate the difference and the advantage of what civil society can confer with an example of one of the members of our network, and forgive me for those who heard me refer to the same organisation earlier this week. But there's an organisation in our network that's called Hatzalah. Hatzalah are a group of volunteer first responders to medical emergencies. They were set up by in response to there was an incident locally in the neighbourhood where someone had a heart attack on the street and died before the ambulance could reach him. And what that led local people to do was say, we need to be able to respond quickly to save lives. And from that initial incident, you have got, in Jewish communities everywhere, you've got Hatzalah organisations which are groups of highly trained volunteers who save lives. They save lives within their own community, they save lives of people outside their non-Jewish lives in the wider community, and they do great stuff. But the point that I want to raise is actually about the flexibility and the passion that comes with civil society organisations. I was working with, part of what we do within our network is we do capacity building and support for organisations, and I was talking to the person who coordinates and runs Hatzalah, and he was telling me about how in their quest to improve the way they work, they have a system where lots of people are on call during the night because it's a 24-hour service, and the system was something like whoever gets the call and picks up the call alerts the network that they're taking it, and that's how it works. And this one person called, one of the members, volunteers, called a meeting and said, and this was about the fact that he felt that within the rest of the volunteer group, people were not responding quickly enough to emergencies at night. And he was worn out because his response was always the quickest, and he was the first one out, and he was just completely worn out. He says, well, what are we going to do about it? And that motivated the group to look at a better system, how are we going to do this, how are we going to share things equally, how are we going to make sure that we have the fastest response times. And the person that was running this, the coordinator who I was working with, said that he was just completely bowled over because he had worked in the private sector and the public sector, and he said, where are the unions? You could just never get that kind of passionate willingness and desire of the people doing the work to say, we want to do this better. It wasn't about conditions and my rights and my pay. It's just about being driven by an absolute passion to do things really well. Of course, there's room for the state and social action groups to cooperate with each other and to take out the best from each other. And this is a lot of work that we do in our network, is bringing the two together and seeing how they can and seeing how they can get the best out of each other. Just want to touch on the very important questions about trust and public manifestations of faith or what your values are in the public domain. Quite clearly, trust is I completely agree that trust is essential, but I think there's an underpinning requirement here before we get to trust each other, and this was also mentioned, and that is respect. when we respect each other's differences and are open to working with people, regardless of what they believe, we value their contribution for what it's worth, that's when we start to trust each other. And it's entirely possible for people to publicly display their faith because it's so integral to their identity that they can't actually separate it out without ramming it down anyone else's throat. I am who I am. We respect each other. We don't expect each other to change for each other, and we can work together on that basis. I would just like to qualify that by saying that sometimes you earn trust without respect first just by doing. So a group like Hatzalah, actually, they don't go out getting respect from people. They just do, and by their social action in doing, that is how they have generated trust and respect. I'd like to just give an example that I think encapsulates the points that I've made, but also some of the points that have been made previously. This is an example of social action in my neighbourhood in North London. The example was when Tony Blair's government came into power and put in place the Sure Start programme, which was aimed to give a good start in life to children from poor communities. Now, social action groups within our network looked at that and said, Sure Start, that sounds like something that's just right for us, we'd like to engage in it. Sure Start is not something about particular faith groups, it's a neighbourhood-based initiative. It wasn't universal, it was about, at the time, the government was selecting particular neighbourhoods for Sure Start programmes. And what we did at the time was we reached out and we approached various different community groups in the neighbourhood, from the faith sector, North London Muslim Community Centre and Housing Association, secular organisations, churches, reached out to the public sector, the NHS, and created a coalition that was committed to a joint goal of improving services for very young children in the area. That coalition was powerful. It said a lot, and we were awarded Sure Start status. Our organisation was elected by the entire coalition, the entire partnership, to be the lead agency, and the local PCT, the NHS, acted as the bankers for the funding. And the resulting programme that we created had the highest levels of reach in all of London, reach being measured by the proportion of children in the area that the programme actually provided service to. It was over 90%, and it wasn't surprising because what we had was just such a wide level of grassroots engagement. Just touching on the points that picking up on the points that you're asking about, in this work, in this successful local social action work in a highly, highly diverse community where there are very fundamental, where the diversity is fundamental. The identities of the different faith groups was never concealed. It was never, on the contrary, that was regarded as the local asset. Nobody tried to influence the other, but the fact that we were coming from different places was regarded as a good thing. It meant that we had local mandate, we had local connections, we had local links. It was very clear, for example, that the Jewish group, Ezeli Alders, was the way to reach Jewish troubled families, whereas the North London Muslim Community Centre was the way to Muslim women. And based on this respect, that was how we developed trust. Just taking that a step further, not only were we clear about our identities, but even, Shana, have I gone over time?
Maybe one more minute,
Okay, I'm almost done. But even with service delivery, we thought about, we accepted, and we welcomed that for different parts of the programme, actually, it wasn't all going to be about interfaith and cross-communal services, but that intra-faith activities were also a local asset. So we considered and we articulated a vision for how there would be some services, actually most services, would be for all local children. So you'd have a new playground for all children. You'd have midwifery services for all women. But there would also be a layer of services that would be universal, but delivered specifically in different locations for different faith groups. And a good example of that was with parenting classes, where Jewish groups gave parenting classes to Jewish mothers, and other groups gave parenting classes for in other settings. And that was the way that we could give, you know, very similar messages, but in ways that could reach and encourage trust and ensure that the message would get across. Now, this kind of collaboration between social action and the state, because that's really what it was. You know, a negative view of it would be that this is the state co-opting civil society to achieve its aims, or you could look at it the other way and say that actually this is the most positive kind of partnership between civil society and the state, where you actually get the best of both, where you can get state resources with civil society's imagination, reach, ideas and compassion, and you can get them both working together. Of course, within our network there are many, many examples of non-state related social action, but where it's completely independent of the state. But I guess I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think that offers a nice compliment, but also challenges, I think, some of the points that were made by Nick and John. So it'd be interesting to pick them up later. Now, going to Julie Siddiqui, who ran a big Iftar Day and who started Sadaqah Day, which is going to be in early 2015. Rather than going to a long introduction, I'll let you.
Thank you. It's really nice to be here. And Julia mentioned earlier that she wasn't an academic, she was a normal person. And I'm neither an academic, and sometimes I don't think I'm a normal person. And I was saying to Abdul Rahman earlier that I'm, you know, ever the optimist, and I'm surrounded by many people that are perhaps a bit more realistic, not here, but in our sort of Muslim community settings that may be more realistic. Maybe it means I'm naive. He reassures me I am just an optimistic activist. And so that's how I present myself to you. So I'm not going to sort of answer the questions as such in bullet points in the way that maybe others have, but just give you some of my own reflections, and also linking it into some of the things that people have already mentioned this morning. Obviously I have that advantage being on the last panel. And also maybe to give you an insight into the Muslim community sort of charity scene, and some of our own successes, but also absolutely some of our challenges as well, because I think it's important for us to constantly be reminding ourselves and also be honest about some of the challenges that we have, that we've identified. When it was mentioned earlier about loneliness being a premature cause of death, it goes back to what you said. You know, it's absolutely important and really shocking for all of us really to hear that kind of statement, and for it to not affect us, I think would mean that there's something very badly wrong with all of us. Also to link into what we're saying today and generally across the country really all the time about cohesion, about how people are or are not getting on, and does that link in with our understanding of charity and social action? And I absolutely would put to you that it does, and it gives us a lot of opportunity, and there is my optimistic bit coming in again. So I think, you know, there's a lot that we can do together. It does require hard work, it does require genuine trust and genuine friendships, but in all of the examples that I've seen, it never fails. And so it's about trying to develop that further. From the Muslim community's perspective, there isn't, by the way, any such thing as the Muslim community, and you know, we know that more than others. There's lots of different viewpoints, points of view, lots of different fractures within, but a lot of, you know, complementing of different points of view as well. So we have all of that going on, and when we're called the Muslim community, you don't know whether to laugh or cry sometimes in realising that really there is no such thing. So our communities within that, mainly, we're talking about the charity sector, mainly focusing on charities that have been established here, but essentially send money to relief work abroad. It's something that was started originally sort of about 30 years ago. The biggest and the best Islamic relief was set up then by a real visionary, somebody with a very big heart who realised that actually we need to do something, and that Muslims based and living in Britain really want to be able to also channel some of their charity money abroad to relief work abroad, not just for Muslims but just generally some of the common things that we all know, wells and orphans and etc. And that model has carried on to the point now where we have quite a number of large-ish charities, although that still remains the biggest and I would argue in some ways the best, but there are other charities there dealing in that same sector. What has now emerged is a general feeling amongst many Muslims that are in Britain that not only does that work need to happen, because it absolutely does, but that some of that money and emphasis needs to be channeled into work here, and not just focusing on Muslims, but some of that needs to be about developing our institutions and leadership, young people, etc., but also working in the system, in society, and doing things here that really benefit others. And from a faith perspective, it was mentioned earlier, I think it was David that mentioned about accountability of our wealth, and it's absolutely a core part of Muslim, Islamic understanding as well, that we're absolutely accountable for what we're given, what we do with it, but also how we spend our time. And what's happened is that the Muslims, I can certainly talk about this country, have become so used to giving money, so that's their form of charity, that they don't necessarily think or consider social action or doing things, getting your hands dirty, as something that they should be engaging with a lot more. I've been sort of in the last couple of years, I would say, privileged to be working with many people in the Jewish community, and have been very inspired and motivated by how they've managed to make this happen in a way that we, I think, can learn a lot from. And obviously we have an established Christian ways of doing charity as well, and we've heard about the food banks today and so many other examples where, if you ask anybody in this country whether they're religious or not, about Christians, they automatically think feeding the homeless, helping the poor, is that kind of thing. If you ask anybody in this country if they think that about Muslims, most people don't consider it in that way, and I think that's something that over time needs to change. So I've learned a lot from the Jewish way, if you like, of doing social action in this country, and it's been something that's really been a motivating factor for me. And certainly on Sunday, for example, Mitzvah Day, which is a one day of social action, which of course, charities for life, not just for Christmas kind of thing, charities for life, not just for Mitzvah Day, but actually what it does is it motivates, even my kids, they're already moaning, by the way, about going on Sunday, but they love it as well. So once I get them there, they're fine, but the idea of getting up at 8:30 in the Sunday morning and going and doing something initially doesn't sound that appealing to them, but once they're there, they love it. So what it does is it brings people together, and initially that started as a Jewish-led sort of movement, if you like, and now has much more branched out into them realising very quickly that it's not only about doing good, but actually can bring people together and can be used in such a way. And I'm actually looking with this idea of Sadaqah Day, Sadaqah being charity, to actually do pretty much the same thing, but from a Muslim perspective, but again working with anybody who really wants to work with us, whether it's religious, people from all different faith groups or no faith. So it's really about trying to change this mindset that as a Muslim, charity is about giving of yourself, as well as flicking that credit card, or nowadays just flicking a button or sending a text message to give in charity, all of which is of course valid, but actually giving of ourselves and our time. And I think that then helps us, but of course it absolutely helps this idea of being out in society. And when we talk about Islam needing a bit of a PR job to be done on it, I think this is one of the things that Muslims need to realise, that actually by action speaks louder than words. Everybody says it, but it's so true. And by bringing people together, working together on something, it's not about preaching or teaching, it's really just about bringing good people together, doing something together. It's very, very powerful. In my experience, it never fails. And also just picking up on some of what's been mentioned earlier around volunteering and how volunteers are difficult to keep and how it's very draining. And I would say to all of you now that we absolutely have a massively exciting pool of young volunteers in the Muslim communities which aren't really being utilised in the way that I think they would like to be. Some of these big charities that I've mentioned are doing okay in using them to bucket shake and collect money that then goes abroad, but in terms of actually getting them out and doing things on the ground, I think there's a lot more that can be done with that. And picking up on this idea about trust, it's absolutely crucial, of course, if we're talking about sort of Muslim and Jewish relations, but also other faiths and no faith, trust and friendship is really important. And I've certainly learned lessons around how much more effective you can be when you develop what I would class as genuine friendships. Tonight I'm on my way home from here, I'm going to some Jewish friend's house with other Muslim Jewish women, trying to develop some of that work, but it's just about friendships. We'll have cake and coffee and might talk about a bit of work as well at the same time. But actually those friendships are crucial, and that trust, so when people talk about shall we have a meeting and do interfaith, I kind of don't relate to it, because I think, what do you mean? We need to actually be moving way beyond that, and if we do things together, it automatically does that job anyway. And just to give another example that I think could work, and this again is where I suppose trust has to come in, and the mindset needs to change. Should we talk about the churches, for example, being clearly very, very good at helping the homeless during the winter, and homeless people, there's a network of churches normally in an area, and people know that every night there's somewhere for them to stay. And I would put to you that mosques have much more space than many churches, and so it's not a space issue, it's a mindset challenge. And it was mentioned earlier, I can't remember who it was, that said that this sort of people needing to get over some of their own, if you like, prejudice, actually both ways and all ways. A lot of mosques would physically have masses of space to cater for something like that, but they could not imagine currently now actually being part of something like that. But I think in the future, if we continue to plug away and develop these friendships and relationships and trust, those are exactly the kind of real tangible things that I can absolutely see happening. And we, as a relatively new and younger sort of community in many ways, don't need to reinvent the wheel. Of course, we've heard brilliant examples today of Trussell Trust and others that were already doing so much fantastic work, and how we link, and it needs people like me and some of us here to make those links happen. And then I absolutely believe that the future is bright in that sense, and I think that it can deal with a lot of the issues that we see without us having to have an agenda to talk about things. It will happen by itself. Thank you.
It's interesting, actually, that on this panel that we have the perspective of two sort of religious minorities in contrast, or another dimension of what we talked about earlier, is the Trussell Trust and the Telford food banks, which are associated with the church. So I'm just going to go straight to you. Abdurrahman Malik, who works for Radical Middle Way as the programs manager, but also is just a very, can I say prominent figure? And you work a lot with
I don't know if I'm prominent.
Okay, you're
A figure.
a figure, you're a figure. Okay, so I'll go straight to you.
Thank you very much, Shana, and good afternoon, everybody. I think Nick and John presented really kind of erudite perspectives, which has got me thinking, and maybe a little bit off course, which is a good thing, actually, because I think they presented some pretty compelling ideas. But listening to Kai and to Julie sort of brings us back to the issue of faith communities, and what are the actual mechanics, and what are the actual ways in which these communities work and operate. And when I was at the London School of Economics, I guess it's now over 10 years ago, I did my master's work at the time on how Muslim voluntary sector organizations engaged in the public policy process. So I looked at one particular organization that had a 30-year history, and looked at the ways in which they actually engaged with major policy conversations from the 1980s to the early 2000s. And for me, what it afforded me an opportunity to do was to examine the mechanics by which we engage in issues of public policy and in issues of social policy. Because I think many of the issues that we're speaking about today are about that kind of engagement. So there is the engagement of doing, and what comes out of that doing, and how policy is made and shaped through the doing, and how communities are changed through doing. I think that's really important. But I think Nick certainly touched upon it, and I think John certainly touched upon it historically, is that then how does public policy and social policy represent and facilitate what is going on the ground? And I think this area, particularly when it comes to the issue of Muslim civil society and the Muslim voluntary sector as a case study, is interesting. Because I think, to echo what Julie says, a lot of action that takes place within certain localized contexts. But there's also a sense, in my experience, of a lack of empowerment, I would even say disempowerment, to engage with broader policy issues, that one can make change perhaps in one's local community or on the ground, or build good relations between faith communities. But does that really filter upwards into some profound changes in which the mechanics of statutory sector government and civil society operate? And for me, that's actually a vital question. And the three questions that are asked today are vital, because we're not merely talking about a grassroots up or a elite level down, but how those two kind of engage and work together into that policy soup, into that soup of a stew of all kinds of engagements that we try to make sense of. So for me, with the question of what kind of society do we want, ultimately is a question that is formulated and reformulated by each and every one of us as autonomous, engaged, empowered citizens, but also within our social solidarities and how we define that. It's difficult not to get utopian when we talk about this, and I think, Nick, you were right to be misty-eyed, because I respect that. Because at the heart of it is, a vision of the kind of societies that we want to live in. Yeah, it should be profoundly utopian and should be profoundly visionary and should make us feel good on the inside at the very least. So for me, when we talk about an accessible public square, a sense of shared ownership of society, or even in a Marxist sense, the means of production, the mechanisms of genuine participation, consensus over mere democracy, mediation of conflicts, perhaps the acceptance that a heightened state of social, economic, or class tension, it does not require resolution all the time, but a better space in which to improve disagreement, and how that disagreement can lead to consensus, a sustainable world, as Nick talked about. Part of that, how would you encompass all of that? Well, for me as a Muslim, big M tribal Muslim, I would look at that as a kind of cosmopolitanism, an acceptance not only of hyperdiversity, in terms of faith or ideology, but also in terms of class, also in terms of history, also in terms of race, also in terms of ethnicity, and recognizing, as Julia said, the absolutely hyperdiversity that exists within microdiversities. And so for me, when I think about our own Muslim communities, most recently I've been really excited about the work of Hamid Dabashi, who's well-known philosopher and historian out of Columbia University. He's written a really nice little book. I think our Christian and Jewish friends and those of no faith but who are interested in faith might be interested in it. It's called Being Muslim in the World. It's a short monograph which some of you will read in an hour, but it took me a few weeks. But in there, Dabashi makes a very interesting point, which for me as a Muslim made a lot of sense. He says that what Muslims need for the full realization of their global citizenship, against both political demonization from the outside and fanatical reductionism from within, is not a belated reformation, but a vibrant restoration of their own enduring historical cosmopolitanism, recast within the current worldly parameters. And Dabashi goes on to make a very compelling historical argument that the hyperdiversity of which we speak about, which we see as kind of a modern thing, actually is not. One needs to only imagine oneself in the mythic Constantinople of yore, or Damascus, or Mecca, or Cairo. And one would find oneself amongst Armenians and Georgians and Christians and Greeks and Jews. One would find themselves amongst a plethora of religious perspectives, and one would find that in the coffee houses of Istanbul or Damascus, an incredible diversity of religious views and difference, many of which would border on what we would now call secular or totally irreligious. So this notion that only modernity is capable of dealing with diversity is crap. It's not. But in fact, that within our own religious traditions, we actually have great capacity to deal with diversity from a historical perspective. And I think part of the challenge within Muslim communities, the young communities that I've had the honor of working with over the past many years, is that how do we engage with some of that historical learning and make it relevant? Which leads to this question of trust. And trust is such a difficult word, because what does it actually mean? Who are we trusting? One another, our neighbors, ourselves, our families. For as much as families, John talks about families helping each other in the past and in now, I might not trust my grandfather as far as I could throw him, but it still means I have to engage with him and he's involved in my life and community. I might not like my imam, but I have to go to him when I need to. Or I think that trust is conditional, right? Trust is always, not to put it in contractual terms, but I think trust is formed and reformed based on the social context environment that we're in. And for me then, it's not a question of trust as a big T trust, but what kind of trusts do we form? And what are the institutions around each of those relationships of trust, formal or informal, that then influence the way in which trust happens? And I think part of the reality that we're living in now, and it's something that I was sort of studying 10 years ago at the LSE, but now for all of you who are engaged in the space, just reality. Contracting out social services, the role of the voluntary sector and civil society in delivering statutory services now become norm. It's common. It's just regular. And so we know that at one level, this kind of downloading of the services of the state on civil society erodes the idea of civil society being able to do advocacy and so on. Contracting mitigates innovation, I think, to a certain degree, because we're constantly up against standards set by the state. But also, I think, for me, trust becomes around what are some of the moral and ethical frameworks of trust. And if I was to look to my own tradition, the prophetic impulse, or the impulse of the Prophet Muhammad, and the social and ethical and moral framework that he and the early community established was really neighborliness, and this idea of a sense of care around neighbor and closeness of community is important. So when Julie quite rightfully talks about the problem and the dilemma in British Islam today of a great money flows going outside of the British Isles, but very little being invested in not just bricks and mortar mosques, but very little invested in the community institution that builds intra-community and inter-community trust, I think is very, very important, because I think we've lost a sense of the prophetic impulse of immediate neighborliness, which is deeply grounded in the space that I'm in and in the context that I'm in. But that having been said, a few years ago, Ash Amin, I think who's at Exeter or Warwick, spoke about trust as being mere prosaic negotiation, the day-to-day rubbing up against one another, dealing with difference. And I live in East London, I live in Whitechapel, where prosaic negotiation goes on all the time. And I find that the best kind of prosaic negotiation is just being friendly and stepping out of your own space and reaching out. And I think all those things make a huge amount of difference. So maybe we're placing too much emphasis on this. Maybe religious people just need to be nicer. Maybe my Bengali neighbors need to hold open the door for others when they leave the apartment block. I mean, yeah, these are things that I observe in my day-to-day. Maybe we just need to smile and say hello on the street. I sometimes think that if we have a PR problem, if 2.7 million Muslims just started making biryani for their neighbors, the Sun and the Daily Mail would have no argument, because biryani is the best food. It sure as heck beats a Yorkshire pudding and all the other stuff that you guys eat. So we can win you over with food and love and a lot of sort of good vibes. But maybe it isn't so simple. I don't know. Sometimes I think it should be that simple. Which leads to the final point around this question of secular and faith. Because I do think that when we talk about contribution, we need to think about what are the engines of contribution. What are the things that power and empower contribution? I think from where I sit, Muslim civil society in the UK is a remarkably broad thing. I think from where my community sits, and certainly doesn't have the experience, Kai, that you would have, and the impressive work that I think within the Jewish sector and amongst our Christian friends as well, that's been done in terms of engaging the Jewish or the Christian voluntary sector. And I'm always impressed, as Julie is, around the incredible institutional work that's happened over a long period of time to build sort of a sense of a civil society community. But when I think about, and part of the work that we've done at Radical Middle Way with some of our friends at the An-Nisa Society, and really under their leadership, is to talk about the notion of what does Muslim civil society mean now. And what we have come to understand is, in fact, there's a lot of civil society action going on. Whether that's the stuff that's the mom and pop community associations that are in a particular estate block or on a particular street, or the reaching out, or the informal networks that help people in difficult times, as well as organizations. There's a lot of dark matter. We can't define it in a way, we can't put our finger on it, but we know that light bends when it goes around it. So we know that it's there, it exists, it's part of the framework that catches people when they're down. And I think that civil society needs strengthening. And the final point that I'll make on this point is that not only does it need strengthening, but it needs understanding. And I think what we have failed, and this is a failure of research, both from within communities and outside, is that we failed to really treat community institutions and civil society, particularly within minority faith traditions, as worthy of research. There was some wonderful work done on Jewish civil society in the late the late 90s, early 2000s, that I found quite inspirational when I was when I was studying this stuff on a more full-time basis. But I think there's a need now to map it. We need to map it, and I think that means street by street, community by community, understanding where the contours of civil society are and social action are. I think we need to strategize about it, understand where it fills gaps, where it helps statutory sector, and where in fact sector needs to step in, what's the capacity issues, and finally how we can best deliver around that. Part of that means changing the culture of giving within our own communities around supporting that civil society. Part of it also means for us to be stronger advocates and actually to point the finger squarely at the state when the state needs to have the finger pointed at it for failing in its obligation to taxpayers and those of us who are giving. And it's part of the whole austerity agenda is that the downloading of essential services onto civil society is a crock. Civil society is unsupported in doing so. We are under a great deal of pressure to deliver on a whole range, and then we have to deliver more. We have to deliver things that our taxpayers' dollars and pounds are going to. It seems silly to me. And therefore, I think there needs to be a much stronger advocacy, and I think the Roundtable today is an indication of the need for that advocacy, especially from faith communities around the austerity agenda, not in a party political way. I frankly don't care who's Labour, Tory, or Lib Dem, but from a practical way, because we're not seeing it from the party political lens, but we're seeing from the lens in which our communities are often suffering underneath this. And I think that brings me back to the beginning, which is the policy agenda. How do we find ways in which engaging with it in a meaningful way, but in a way that hopefully will be a good push, or we can leverage it to make some kind of political change.
Thank you very much. You can introduce yourself.
I hope you don't mind if I stand up. We've come to that point in the afternoon where there's a danger of people falling asleep. And there's a lovely line in Yes Minister where Jim Hacker's thinking about reshuffling his cabinet, and he says, well, one of the cabinet members always falls asleep. He said, well, lots of cabinet members fall asleep. Yes, but he started falling asleep when he talks. So I'm standing up because I'd quite like to stay awake in the brief contribution I make, even if some of you nod off. I just really want to ask three questions, three things for us to think about. One, what kind of society do we want in the future? Who's the we? Whose voice gets heard? I attended a Christian act of worship which was focused on poverty and social justice, and was very struck by the fact that quite unself-consciously it had been written in a way in which none of the prayers could have been prayed by someone who was poor. The language was all assumed that there was an us who was involved in concern and service provision for a them. And so how do we get this conversation to be one in which the poor are not dehumanized and talked about as a problem, but actually their voices are heard in the debate? The Centre for Theology and Community grows out of church's engagement in community organising with Citizens UK, and I suppose that's one response which goes across religious and civic groups coming together to say in a fragmented and unequal society, one thing that needs to happen is that the voices of those communities, the voices of the poorest, need to be heard in this debate. So I think the first answer I would give, really building on what you were saying, is that the conversation needs to be one in which the voice and perspective of the poorest is heard more clearly. And of course, I mean, I'm sure we could say this for each of our faith traditions, but just thinking as a Christian, it is extraordinary that we should have an act of worship that treated the poor in that way, when you consider how central the agency of the poorest is to the stories in our scriptures, from the Hebrew slaves through to the Christian belief that the incarnation happened not in a palace, but among God chooses to dwell among the poorest. So again and again in scripture and in the life of the church, the poor are the agents of change through whom God works. How do we recover a sense of that when we think about faith and social action? That leads on to the second point about the common good. I mean, I agree with Nick that it's absolutely central. I grew up, as perhaps dates me particularly, Yes Minister, but also Agatha Christie, you know, Joan Hickson as Miss Marple, and the figure of the vicar, always kind of benign but rather helpless, just generally gesturing at everyone to be a bit nicer and a bit kinder. And the language of the common good isn't really about that when we think about it at some depth. I suppose at the heart of certainly a Christian conviction about the common good would be the thought that our good is bound up together, and that actually a society in which there are vast inequalities between rich and poor impoverishes everyone. There's, I mean, if you think about how Scripture and how Catholic social teaching help us to understand wealth, it's a gift from God, and it's given that we might, as Nick was saying, grow in relationship. I guess that's one of the reasons why Scripture is so obsessed both with possessions and with sex. They're both about what kind of relationships, what kind of faithfulness we embody in our material relationships. So the common good isn't simply about being a bit nicer and being a bit kinder. If we take the common good seriously, it's quite a challenge to the way in which wealth is hoarded and distributed. And that, of course, is a question, part of which might be about the action of civil society. That's certainly the bit I'm involved in. But I think it also raises questions about the tax system and how the state distributes and redistributes wealth. Do we take for granted that people's gross income is what they are entitled to? Or is redistribution of wealth through the tax system partly about restoring to people what they are due? I had the dubious privilege of being told last week by Melanie Phillips, no less, that I was a living example of why the Church of England had lost the plot, precisely because I was arguing that there needs to be that kind of redistribution. We need to separate out in our debate about politics the question about how large and small the state needs to be from what's actually potentially quite a different question, which is how wealth and income are distributed and redistributed. And interestingly, it was in fact David Cameron who said before the last election in his Hugo Young lecture, who talked about the empirical research that says that we are all impoverished by a society where there is growing inequality. So for me, there's something there which is both about the common good, the fact that we grow together in community through a right sharing of wealth, and the agency of the poorest, because it's often the poorest that see that most clearly and will organise to change it most effectively. Which brings me, I suppose, on to the third point, which is about the role community organising has had in that. And the fact that just this last week, two of the more positive stories in the news are about the growth and success of the Living Wage campaign, and about what's going on in terms of getting a cap on payday lending. And I think it was Jonathan Friedland of The Guardian who observed, it almost sounds like the start of a joke, a rabbi, an imam and a priest, ... And you might well imagine that a rabbi, an imam and a priest, if they had to talk about the common good, could only agree on something that was a bit vacuous. How can we actually get agreement on something that's deep and substantive and challenging? And yet the example of both the Living Wage campaign and the work that's been going on to demand a cap in payday lending is that actually faith communities on the ground in the poorest neighbourhoods, when they work together, do discern and promote a concept of the common good which is substantive and which is challenging.
I think that was a great way to conclude because you've been very succinct but very direct. So I will open the floor to questions. Now I think there might be discussion from earlier panels as well if you didn't get a chance to ask a question. Yes. Yes.
Gabriella.
Gabriella.
So I'm going first because we are leaving soon.
Yes, I
It's been a
figured that.
wonderful day. Thank you very much for inviting me. I just want to say a few things to some of the excellent presentation. Ethnic community organisation, I think, is very interesting from many perspectives. But I just want to, so all groups, minority, majority groups, display over time, sort of affiliations towards a British identity. So the idea that minorities do not have a British identity is simply, as Anthony Heath writes, it's a slur on British citizens. Also what we find is that ethnic minorities typically would have a dual identity, and I think that's important. Ethnic minorities tend to agree with civic norms that support cohesion in a similar way as to what people identify them as white British. So I think this relationship between solidarity, loyalty and welfare and all sort of things, it is not as simple as is being discussed. Definitely not in the press. So So that's what I wanted to say.
Yes. I'll do two questions actually, and then we'll go because we're on a time frame. So I'll do, yes, if you'd like to.
Okay. I just wanted to comment on Julie and Abdurrahman, because me and Sabina, we talked about why we don't have a Muslim community like in Tav, why we can't integrate them, why we don't have this in mosque. And I discussed with a young refugee volunteer I met in the intercultural dialogue thing, and they found themselves as the first refugee volunteer group from the Muslim community in Berlin, because of the refugees that were on Oranienplatz. I don't know if you heard this in the media. They all came to Berlin to make a protest about the policy, how they react with refugees. And on one hand, I think, yeah, it's. I'm sorry that we have one like Tafel, yeah, a food bank where the people come, and I see there come the Muslim people and they're all customers, and there's no Muslim on the other side, but we have so many in our society. But I think the problem is, you said there is not that Muslim community. All the Muslims I know, they are separated, not even if they're Shia or Sunnite or whatever, and then it's specialized in between, and in between countries, yeah, and ethnic things, so that there is not such group. And these Muslim people who come to our food bank, they're all refugees and all from separated countries, so they don't have this community group. And on the other hand, when I asked the baker in my neighborhood, I like him, I get my things there, and I said, yeah, if you have some extra in the evening, if you see this, now I have this job, can I get it from there? He said, oh yes, if there is sometimes something extra, I will give you. But we do it in our neighborhood. We have some people, we have some family, and they come and get it because they are poor. So, and there's a homeless man in my street, and there's some Arabian restaurant, and there's some other little companies, and there the people give him money because he's coming in the evening, helping them to get the tables in. So I think it's more hiddenly. It's not so big and organized, but more in this neighborhood community that you don't see it. And the only family in my house, I'm working as a volunteer for a refugee home and now my community. The only family who gave me something when I was asking in the house for some gifts for the people coming to our community when the new refugee home was built was my Shiite neighbors directly. Yeah, because yeah, this is a direct thing, a very on a very basic level, and this functions. This works very good. Yeah.
Thank you. Would you like to answer? You want to answer Gabriela's question first?
So maybe we have to learn. This is
Right. So Gabriela was asking about, well, sort of a question in the
Yeah, it
statement.
was more perhaps of a comment.
Yes.
In not the frustration with the panel at all, but frustration on kind of the media coverage. That's
Right.
what I thought. So perhaps it was a comment more than that. The question.
I think it's a really worthy remark. And I'll speak plainly, although this is on the record, so I do fear that slightly. So you may have to edit this out. But I think that we are currently we have fetishized identity to the point that it has actually become ridiculous. And I'm really tired myself. I don't want to talk about British Muslim identity anymore. It's a waste of my time. And it's a dead-end conversation. Because the fact is, it's more complicated than that. And you're absolutely right. When it comes to the research, it's showing us again and again a movement, an identity movement that, if not in word, then in deed, reflects the majoritarian, popular conceptions of identity. So I think, in a way, we are flagellated with the litmus test of how British we are, and then what we do is we turn that whip on ourselves, and in this kind of masochistic way, we beat ourselves about how British we are and whether that's we can integrate that with our Muslimness. Where in fact, on a daily basis, no one really gets up in the morning except pundits and the commentariat, and they worry about how British we are or how Muslim we are. People generally just get on with their lives. I think the issues around quote-unquote identity are actually far deeper. There's more deeper fault lines than Britishness and Muslimness, and they have to do with maybe what those things mean in complexity rather than at surface level. But the conversation that's imposed on all of us, not just us, on you, on everyone, is the litmus test of identity, which I think is incumbent upon us now, is to try and break out of that, because otherwise we're always going to be at a surface level conversation. It's like John pointed out, the historical stuff is so interesting because it mitigates against all these notions of community, individualism, communalism, and you realize that in fact it's far more complex and interesting.
And always has been.
And always has been, than we would allow it to be. So why are we so stuck? And I speak to my own communities. Why are we so stuck on this issue? Because there's a sense of there's also a sense of unease, unease around politics and so on. But those are political questions. But we're not addressing them politically. We're addressing through the lens of belonging, and I think that's a terrible mistake.
That's interesting. That's great. Okay, thank you, and thank you for coming. Those of you
Thank
who
you
are-
very much. It's been a great day.
Thank you. Yes.
I just wanted to pick up on your point about, so in a way, for me, I've kind of gone around this as well in my head. I think there is, some of that is probably happening, so it's basically under the radar, it's just natural. So someone will come and be fed, etc. But of course it shouldn't be under the radar, I don't think. And also, first of all, people need to know that is happening because it's a very positive thing and it's a good thing. But also, I feel that there are many Muslims, ordinary, average Muslim families that may not be activists or politicians or any of that. Actually, when they're given an opportunity to do something practical, they will do it. And the two things that come to mind straight away, one is so what's happening now in Ramadan, so obviously, we fast for 30 days, and there's very much a sense that it's not just about, it's very charity heavy, so it's very much, there's a lot of focus on charity, of doing good, of giving more money, of feeding people because we're hungry so we know what it feels like. It's very much that sense, and of course this is 30 days of that every year. So that sense of charity, and I think what's been quite nice for us to see is that sense of charity is much more known now. So people in wider, outside of the Muslim communities realise that Ramadan is also about charity and generosity and things, and that's nice. And a few years ago, some young people, without any organisation behind them or any bureaucracy or anything, through social media, set up flash mob iftars, which is where we break the fast. So they organised and just got people to come together in cities and fed the homeless essentially in the city centre. You don't even need a list of who's bringing what. Just come, and it kind of works, and it did. And the other example, and what's happened is that, and I really appreciate them doing that because it actually forced people to think, wow. Because what I was going to say was, once people get into something, they realise this is so easy. Why have we not been doing this before? And this is where we're at now. I think if we facilitate, so that's what I feel I can do, is try and facilitate more people to do things. Those relationships form, and then they kind of get on with it on their own. The other example would be the floods that we had recently this year in local areas. Areas were badly flooded, so these are not necessarily families that are poor, but they were caught out because they were flooded in or whatever. And also the firemen and the services that helped them needed food. And so I, even in my local area, just literally made one phone call to one of these angelic, amazing women who's Christian, called Sue, who always is everywhere where there's need for people to have help. And I thought, I know who I'm going to ring her. So I rang her and I said, look, there must be something that the Muslim communities from this area can do. So we just had a couple of conversations, a couple of emailing and texting exchanges. I then spoke to the local restaurant owner, who's always very generous and never questions, always gives. And, overnight we ended up with actually too much food, to be quite honest. And when we took it, myself and one other just took it to the Salvation Army kind of van that was helping to, look after the firemen, and literally the ladies behind the counter were kind of like, oh my God, I don't actually know what to do with all of this chicken and rice and stuff. But of course the firemen were very happy that they had a lunch for, you know, for over all those days. So the reason I mention those two things, very simple, doesn't need overload of bureaucracy, it doesn't really even need that many people, but when Muslim, generally families are given an opportunity to do something practical, and this would apply to restaurants and individuals, and they will do it. And so that's where I think we need to, it's about making the links really, and relationships between people like me, Sugra, Abdurrahman, others, people, anyone who's working in communities who can then be those bridges and those links and make it happen. And it will happen. And then it's about working with established organisations like Trust for Trust and others to do it so that you don't reinvent the wheel. And I think there's a very good, it's a match made in heaven, you could say. Because we have the volunteer, you know, very young population as well, of young activists, young people just want to, who on the wide variety of the spectrum of religiosity, some more than others, but still feel this need to do something and do good and put some use to their time. And we need to utilise that. We've got the youngest group out of any other, and they're willing and able and wanting to do things, and we need to use them a lot more.
I've got one question for everybody. Several of you have mentioned utopia. We're looking at what kind of society do we want in the future. I'd love to hear from each of you. What one step would you say was the next step to get you to the kind of society you'd like to see us in the future?
Do you mind introducing yourself?
Sorry, I'm Rona Knight. I'm an ex-GP, but I'm an alternate at Ridley Hall at the moment.
John, do you want to start?
No, I don't. I'm just thinking it through. I'd have leapt forward if I had something to say instantly. One first thing.
Yeah.
Sorry.
My initial thing would be for people to come out of their comfort zone and to just meet others, because although it sounds simple and sometimes can seem a bit wishy-washy, but actually I think it can be quite profound and it makes so much difference. So all of us need to come out of our comfort zones and not be looking at people as the other, but actually realising that we're all in this together, and to make this country better. I love this country, but to make it even better, we can all have a stake, but we have to come together genuinely, and I don't think we are at the moment. Yes.
I think a more powerful voice of, not just for the poorest, and that would, it's a wonderful thing when you see it develop, when you see people develop that confidence. I also think, if you just take something like the debate going on welfare, just as a kind of example, in my parish, the real obstacle to people getting into work is that if they get into a short-term job that may or may not last very long, they're not confident that when that job ends, the benefit system will pay their benefit when they need it. Now, that's never heard in the debate. There's this great debate about dependency and welfare into work. The reality is that the broken benefit system makes it very difficult for someone to take that step, because when the job ends, it might be weeks before. That perspective's never heard in the debate. So I think if I really like one thing, then it would be that.
I've come up with something now.
Yes.
So we all have, haven't we? Sorry.
Okay.
Well, the honest truth, the simplest thing, is we should probably be paying 44 to 45% of GDP as tax, rather than currently 38 to 39%. And then, if we did that, we would spend less time running around as bandaging the problems of society, and more time doing the positive things that I'm actually really optimistic after today, because all the things that you're talking about are the things I want to see, a vibrant society doing, but it shouldn't be sticking plasters on the social problems. They actually could easily be dealt with if we paid more tax, and then you would still not have the perfect society, and you could do a lot more to make society healthier in a broad way. So that's what I thought.
I'm really fascinated by the things that the one single thing that people have come up with. I think that a couple at the two ends, we've had ideas which are quite political, and I even think that, Julie, yours is less political, but there's still something that's they've all got a little bit of social engineering to them. It's about go out and meet others, and I think that they're great, you know, and we can I don't think there's anything to argue with you, Julie. We can argue about the others. But yes, we
People
can.
do.
Yeah, we can argue about that. And I think the thing, what that says to me, and my first thought was, if everyone just does something for someone else, not themselves, not their own immediate family, go and do for someone else. Now, it's going to be different in different ways. You might want, and I'm all for this, you know, I like campaigning, I like policy shaping process. So for some, it will be that. For others, it will be about going out and meeting people. I think probably for the majority, it's just going to be about what you call the sticking plaster. You know, if you forgive me for saying a little bit disparagingly, but I think that it's that people focusing outwards rather than inwards. And we'll always argue about what's the best and what's the right way to do it. But the critical point is being socially active, not looking inwards, but being outward looking. I think that, you know, I feel hugely privileged that my work is with a network of organisations, because what that means, what that means is that I'm exposed to and privileged to work with such different types of people, and they will do their social good in such different ways. It's amazing, it's inspirational, there's so much difference there. Some will be shouting and changing policy, and some will be out there visiting this. They'll just be doing different things. And I don't think there's a one thing that's going to shift it. I think it's that social action itself that's, you know, for me is the winner.
Thank you.
Wow. I makes want to change my opinion. I had two. The one which came to mind was very similar to yours, John. That we should cancel Trident and we should decommission our nuclear weapons, because frankly the savings from that alone would be enough to cover the shortfall in the NHS and the education system, and we would be no less the safer and far richer. A country like this continuing to having a nuclear arsenal is next to ridiculous, ludicrous, and insane. But the other part of me felt, as Julie did, that if we talk about the prophetic impulse, part of, I think, what prophets do well is agendas for social transformation. You know, the best, I think part of the challenge of what you suggest, Kai, in terms of doing, is that I think often our doing needs direction. And I think as a religious person, there is something about you know, prophetic vision which allows us to have a social agenda. So maybe it's because I'm a former Islamist way back in my past, but I do believe in sort of agendas for social transformation. Maybe it's because I'm a former Marxist. So I do think that the whole idea of neighborliness, if each and every one of us took on, you know, as 10 houses above or below in our estate, or 10 doors next to each other, and just got to know, just knock on the door. How difficult it is to knock on the door. You know, anyone who's politically campaigned or canvassed, the difficulty of going up to a stranger's door and presenting an idea. Well, how much easier would it be to present a cake or biryani, or just to say hello, and just say, hey, we've lived next to each other for 10 years, we've never said hello. And just think that those prosaic negotiations, those little things, may actually be quite terribly profound.
I'll bring a Yorkshire pudding.
There you go. There you go. We'll have a food off.
Are there other questions? If not, I think are we pushing our time? And, well, I want to thank you very much. I want to thank everybody who stayed the whole day. It's been a great day, at least for Christina and myself as the organizers. I appreciate your coming. And I'm sure if you want to stay a bit and have a conversation on an individual level, you're welcome to. On behalf of the Wolf Institute, Christina, thank you for coming, and I think we'll call it a day.